The first thing to do is set up a little staged scenario like the one you see here. Put the camera on a tripod. This is very important so that we don't have to worry about camera shake, especially if we end up with some slow shutter speeds. Remember I said if the light is not sufficiently bright enough, we may have to open the shutter for a longer period of time. The tripod will keep the camera still during these slower shutter speeds. Here you can see a setup with two LED panels lighting up two ornaments against a black background. The ornament at the back is there for a reason which will become apparent later. We talked about how the camera meters the available light to indicate the exposure on the exposure meter. To further demonstrate how metering and the exposure meter works, I have intentionally used a black background. You will see why shortly. If you haven't got any LED panels, then any bright table lamps will do the trick. Don't worry if the lights aren't too bright. You can always slow down the shutter speed to get a good exposure. On the next slide, we will take the photo and explain the settings, and also how the camera has metered the light and see the results. Our first photo, and the light meter. Now that you know what some of the symbols mean, you can read the values of the settings that were used to take this photograph. We can see the ISO is set at 100 and the aperture is set at 2.8. Being a small number, we know that the aperture is very wide. The lens I am using is a 50mm prime and 2.8 is its widest setting. Prime just means the lens is a fixed focal length. Once the aperture and ISO are set, we can manually adjust the shutter speed until the exposure meter shows no bars on its scale. In this case, a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second makes this so. Everything is set, and we can take the photograph. But look! Our little nurse looks a bit on the bright side. In fact, you could say she is overexposed. Why is this? Remember, I said I used a black background for a reason. Have a look at the metering mode. Can you remember what we said about how the light meter works? If you look at the settings, you can see the light meter is in matrix mode. In this mode, the camera accounts for all the light and dark areas in the whole frame, and when you adjust the shutter speed it will indicate the best exposure. In this case, to set the exposure meter to 0, the camera is recommending a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. What is happening is that the matrix metering is looking at a lot of black and therefore takes all this dark into consideration while you adjusting the shutter speed. It thinks that because there is lots of dark it has to account for this when it meters the light. As a result, the little nurse, which doesn't take up much of the area, ends up being overexposed. Note: if your camera was in one of the auto modes we mentioned earlier and you had the metering set as matrix, then this is the result you would get. As we are in manual, we can make the shutter speed a bit faster so that the nurse is less exposed. You could do this by trial and error until you get a shutter speed that gives you the desired results. Or, we can change the camera light meter to a different mode, as you will see on the next slide. This bit could be tricky to get your head around, but let's give it a go. Remember, looking at the last photograph we could see that the little nurse was overexposed because the camera's light meter was compensating for all the black in the frame, and to get the light meter to read 0, we had to adjust the setting as shown on the previous slide. But we do not want to meter all the frame, as in matrix mode, we just want to meter the little nurse. To do this, we change the metering mode to spot metering. You will see by the above photo, the metering indicator is now a dot. This means when you look through the viewfinder, the only area metered is the center of the viewfinder. In other words, a dot in the center of the screen. This spot can be moved around the frame, but for now, let's just look at the dot being in the center of your viewfinder and positioned directly over the center of the little nurse. We have not altered the shutter speed, the ISO, or the aperture. The only difference we have made is the metering mode from matrix to dot. At these settings, we know that the nurse was overexposed, and if you look at the exposure indicator, you can see that the spot we are metering is indeed going to be overexposed at these settings. It's up to us to change a setting so that the exposure meter reads 0. We can forget about all the black in the frame, because now the only bit of the frame that is being metered is the center spot on the nurse. As our little nurse was overexposed, we need to alter a setting so that less light hits the photosensor or the same light for a reduced amount of time. We could alter the aperture by making it smaller, and that would push the exposure meter reading towards 0. Or, like in this case, we can increase the shutter speed. As you can see, I have had to increase the speed to 1/250th of a second to move the exposure meter to 0. This is now showing the correct exposure for the spot, which is directly on the nurse, due to our spot metering mode, and all the surrounding area is not being metered at all. We take a photo and as expected, the nurse is now more satisfactorily exposed. The surrounding area is, as expected, much darker, but that doesn't matter because in essence it's a black background, and indeed, it is now very black. With all this in mind, you should be able to work out what will happen if we use matrix metering and spot metering with a white background. See if you can work it out, and we will look at that scenario in the next video. This is all to get you used to the difference between matrix and spot metering. It also shows that it doesn't always get it right, and it's up to you to adjust the settings accordingly. Just zeroing the exposure meter with any chosen metering mode doesn't necessarily give you the desired result, as we have seen, but it's a good guide and any tweaking of settings can be done by you, because after all, remember, we are in manual mode. Please subscribe.